Hat, sunglasses, Pepsi, notes, sources, thick skin. Check. You already know. Let's go. Welcome to Gold and Blue today, everybody. This is a college football channel. So if you like college football, hit the like and subscribe button. It's that simple. Also, send gear to represent your team and be a part of my background forever. All you have to do is send it to P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina 29657. Man, what a crazy Week 10. What a crazy Week 10. Yeah, actually, what a crazy 2022 so far. It is very reminiscent of 2007. Maybe not that chaotic, but it's getting pretty close, guys. It's getting pretty close. The top 10 did not do well yesterday. The top 10 did not do well, and it reintroduced some other teams to possibly making the playoffs in the future as far as making the rankings. Yeah, it's possible. Teams like Oregon, teams like USC, teams like UCLA, teams like North Carolina. Yeah, I do think that North Carolina has a very, 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 very small chance of making the playoffs. Of course, a lot more things need to happen, but yesterday was a big step towards the direction of utter chaos. First things first, the biggest game of the day. Number 1, Tennessee at number 3, Georgia. Both of these teams were undefeated going into this game. 8-0. Georgia wins 27-13. Tennessee makes it a little bit close in the second half. Tennessee only had 289 offensive yards the entire game. That is not on par for the course for Tennessee. Now, having said that, Georgia only scored 3 points in the second half. So they definitely did not have a good second half. And they've shown that they have been vulnerable. I mean, Kent State, they didn't look good. They barely beat Missouri. Georgia does not look like a national championship contender. However, they did beat Tennessee, so that's a step in the right direction. Tennessee is not out of the playoff picture, not by a long shot. Games remaining. Missouri, at South Carolina, at Vanderbilt. Now, if Georgia doesn't lose two games in the SEC, they have to lose 2 games, Tennessee will still make the SEC championship. But even if they don't make the SEC championship, so much happened yesterday that Tennessee could still make the playoffs. Easily, actually. Easily. Not, they need a bunch of things to happen. No, yesterday, a bunch of things happened. So Tennessee could still quite easily make the playoffs. Now, for Georgia, their remaining schedule: at Mississippi State, at Kentucky, and Georgia Tech. So they do have 2 tricky road trips for their next 2 games. And if they just split those 2 games, lose 1, win 1, then they're going to the SEC championship. Now, if they lose both of them, Tennessee wins out, then Tennessee would get to the SEC championship. But I think Georgia gets to the SEC championship, and I think Georgia probably makes the playoffs as well. Yes, it is very possible that Georgia and Tennessee both make the playoffs. I mean, at least Tennessee didn't get completely humiliated. They're still in this. What about Ohio State, the number 2 team in the nation? Well, they still are undefeated, but man, they did not look good against Northwestern. They did win 21-7, but only 283 offensive yards. Northwestern had 285 offensive yards. Yes, Northwestern outgained Ohio State by 2 yards. That is crazy. Remaining schedule for Ohio State: Indiana, at Maryland, and number 5, Michigan. So Ohio State definitely still controls their own destiny. All they have to do is win out. They're getting to the Big Ten championship game. They win the Big Ten championship game. Boom, they're in the playoffs. It looks like Ohio State will make the playoffs as long as they beat Michigan in that last game. The next game, wow. Number 4, Clemson at Notre Dame. And I actually did predict Notre Dame to beat Clemson because even though Notre Dame has lost the bad teams, they've beaten all the really good teams on their schedule. They went on the road and beat North Carolina. Turns out, North Carolina's a decent team. They beat a ranked BYU, and BYU was pretty hot at the time. They went on the road and shut down Syracuse. And then yesterday, by far their best win, beating number 4 Clemson, not just beating them, but humiliating them 35-14. Clemson only had 281 yards on offense. Technically, Clemson is still in the playoff hunt, but man, their offense has got to get much, much better. They have a decent defense, but like we saw yesterday, if their defense is having a bad game, they're not going to win football games. Remaining schedule for Clemson, pretty easy. So at least there's your bright spot, Clemson fans. Louisville at home, Miami, Florida at home, and South Carolina at home. All winnable games. And then, of course, you'll probably play North Carolina in the ACC Championship. And if you win that game, you have a good shot of making the playoffs simply because of everything else that's happened around you. But man, I don't know if I would want to go to the playoffs if I was a Clemson fan. That did not look good yesterday. And if you do somehow backdoor your way into the playoffs, you could get blown out. Next game, number 5, Michigan. Also undefeated 9-0 on the road to Rutgers. Whoops them 52-17. But they were down 17-14 at halftime. However, Rutgers scores 0 second half points. Michigan pulls away, blows them out. And Michigan has looked like a consistent football team. Michigan looks like a playoff team. Remaining schedule for Michigan: Nebraska, number 16 Illinois. But Illinois lost to Michigan State yesterday, so maybe they're not as good as what we thought. And then at number 2, Ohio State. That is a big, big game. I do think that's a winnable game for Michigan. However, if they do lose that game and they don't make the Big Ten championship, they could still make the playoffs because of everything that's happened around them. Now, they would need some help, like they would need Clemson to lose another game and maybe Tennessee or Georgia to pick up a loss, something like that. But they're still in good shape. Michigan's still in good shape, even if they lose on the road to number 2 Ohio State. Now, if they beat Ohio State, then they're gravy. They're probably going to make the playoffs because more than likely they're going to win the Big Ten championship. Let's keep going. Top 10 matchup. The other top 10 matchup. Number 6, Alabama at number 10, LSU. Alabama came into this game with just 1 loss. Now they have 2 losses because LSU goes for 2 in overtime and they convert and they beat Alabama 32-31. This was a great game. So now both of these teams are 7-2. Here's the thing. LSU now controls their own destiny whenever it comes to SEC championship game because, yes, they have 2 losses, but one of those losses was out of conference to Florida State in the first game. The other loss was a blowout loss to Tennessee, and that was a home game. So they did get blown out by Tennessee. Alabama has 2 losses in the SEC. They lost on the road to Tennessee, and then yesterday they lost on the road to LSU. And their schedule, I don't know, man. At number 11, Ole Miss, that's a losable game. Then you get FCS Austin Peay. Then you get Auburn at home. So the last 2 games pretty much gimme games. But Alabama could pick up another loss because they have to go back on the road and play probably going to be a top 10 Ole Miss. Alabama with 3 losses in a season, we haven't seen that in a while. We haven't seen a 2-loss Alabama in the regular season in a while. So yes, this is definitely a down year for Alabama. What about LSU? They control their own destiny for the SEC championship game. Remaining schedule, 2 tough road trips, or at least tricky road trips. At Arkansas, UAB at home, and then at Texas A&M. So Arkansas and Texas A&M, they're not really any good, but they are road tests, and it could be tricky. But if LSU can win out, LSU is headed to the SEC championship. And if LSU can pull the upset and win the SEC championship, then a 2-loss SEC champion will make the playoffs. Make no mistake about it. The playoff committee will not deny the SEC champion from the playoffs. They will get to the playoffs. So that's another storyline to keep your eyes on. So let's say that Tennessee wins out. They're sitting there. They don't make the SEC championship. They have 1 loss. Georgia wins out, but loses to LSU. So they're the SEC runner-up with 1 loss in the SEC championship. Then LSU wins the SEC championship, 2 losses. Does that open the door for 3 teams from the SEC to make the playoffs? I think it does. It's something to keep our eyes on, especially considering what's happened around. Clemson picking up a loss, that helps with that scenario. Ohio State not looking that great. And we know Ohio State and Michigan both play each other. So what if the winner goes on and loses in the Big Ten championship? And then there's TCU. TCU is still undefeated. They beat Texas Tech 34-24, 429 offensive yards, but they're number 75 in scoring defense. They do not have a good defense. I talked about the Big 12 officiating yesterday, how they're starting to keep the flags in the pocket whenever it comes to pass interference for TCU. Watch that defense. It's very aggressive, but they do pass interfere a lot. They do not have a good defense. However, their remaining schedule at number 24, Texas. That's a tough game. Texas is looking good. At Baylor and Iowa State. So by no means does TCU have an easy path to the playoffs because they have to get through that undefeated and then win the Big 12 championship, which would be a rematch with either Oklahoma State, Kansas State, or Texas. So you'd have to beat a very good team twice in the same season. But TCU does control their own destiny. Does the Big 12 get into the playoffs via TCU? The Pac-12 is not out of it. they have 3 pretty good teams. And in the new playoff rankings, I think all 3 of these teams will be in the top 10 because of everything that's happened around them. The first one, the highest ranked, number 8, Oregon. They beat Colorado 49-10. They're 8-1. Their only loss, the first game to Georgia. If you're going to lose, you want it to be early in the season, and you want it to be to Georgia. Remaining schedule, though, this is tough, guys. Washington at home, number 14, Utah at home, and then at number 23, Oregon State. Do not overlook Oregon State. Yes, they lost to Washington, but that was a tough road trip, and they only lost by 3. Oregon State's a good team. Oregon still has some potential pitfalls on that schedule. But if they can run the schedule and win the Pac-12, Oregon can make the playoffs. The next team, number 9, USC. They did beat Cal 41-35. They're now 8-1. Their only loss was to Utah, but they allowed 469 yards to Cal. How does that happen? USC's defense has got to get better if they want to be considered a playoff team. Remaining schedule, Colorado at number 12, UCLA, and then a tricky home game against Notre Dame. Listen, Notre Dame, they're not great. They've lost to bad teams, but they've beaten all the really good teams on their schedule except for that first game on the road to Ohio State. So that is not a gimme game. USC still has a tough 3 remaining games on their schedule except for Colorado. But if they can get through the remaining schedule and win the Pac-12, USC could also make the playoffs. And finally, the last team for the Pac-12, not in the top 10 currently, but when the new playoff rankings come out, they might be in the top 10, and that's number 12, UCLA. Also just one loss, lost to Oregon. They beat Arizona State 50-36, but they also allowed 468 offensive yards. Remaining schedule, Arizona, number 9, USC, and at Cal. So their remaining schedule is very, very doable. They do have to play USC, but it is at home. And even if they don't have a good home turnout, at least it could be a 50-50 crowd split, and that's better than having to go on the road and play USC. And UCLA is very, very, very capable of beating USC. Hey, if UCLA runs the table, wins the Pac-12, they could also make the playoffs as well. And finally, the last team I want to talk about, number 17, North Carolina. They do go on the road and prevail. They beat Virginia 31-28. That makes them 8-1 now. But they also allowed 455 offensive yards. You can't do that. Remaining schedule, this is a tough one. At number 21, Wake Forest. Then Georgia Tech at home. And then number 22, NC State at home. But if they can run the table and then beat Clemson in the ACC Championship, North Carolina might have a case to make the playoffs. Now, they're a little bit lower ranked, so it's going to take some more work above them. But they could feasibly make the playoffs. Week 10 was a crazy week. It shuffled the playoff picture a lot. We already know that the SEC champion makes the playoffs. We already know that the Big X champion is going to make the playoffs. Outside of that, who knows? Is the ACC done? With Clemson losing to Notre Dame, does that mean that the ACC is going to be left out of the playoffs this year? I don't know. It depends on what Clemson looks like the rest of the year. And you got to watch out for North Carolina. What about the Big 12? Well, all the eggs are in the basket of TCU. If they trip up and lose once or twice, it could be over for the Big 12. And then there's the Pac-12. They have 3 teams with 1 loss. One of those teams, just one of those teams could finish the season with 1 loss. And boom, the Pac-12 could also pick up a spot in the playoffs. So this playoff race is far from being clear. This was a crazy week. I love it. This is why we love college football. So y'all let me know in the comments section. Number 1, do you think this is it? Is it over for the ACC? Are they out of the playoffs for the 2nd year in a row? Number 2, do you think the Big 12 makes the playoffs via TCU? And number 3, do you think the Pac-12 finally makes the playoffs this year, the first time in like 5 or 6 years? One of those teams finishes the season with 1 loss, other things happen, and boom, the Pac-12 makes the playoffs. That's all I got for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.